All right, come on. It's time to dance. Get your socks pulled up there, baby. Hey, you know, there's a new thing in the world, and I'm pleased. We're just giving you this as a straw in the wind. For those of you who, I think one of the things that people, my friends, people, that you see and that you hear on television, that you know on radio and so on, they keep thinking that everything that happens in the world that is, say, decadent or whatever it might be, is an American thing. In other words, I mean, you just don't know human nature if you think that. In other words, I was having a big argument with a guy one day. He says, this car-loving culture of ours, American hang-up on cars, that's so... He's never been to Rome. Romans really do love their cars. I mean, Americans don't. Americans leave them out in the rain, and they bash in the sides. They write stuff on the back in four-letter words. You don't see that. Why, the most common sight in Rome are a bunch of elegant guys dressed in $700 suits out dusting their cars with feather dusters while they're waiting for their dates to arrive. Oh, yes! Oh, and somebody I heard the other day, somebody said, well, look at the problems. Look at this senator is having this affair with this woman and this one. I don't know what's happening in American culture. Are you trying to tell me that Attila the Hun was American? Takes a little while for you to think that deep thought through. But are you trying to tell me that, no. Would you please, we'd like to salute the latest report on hanky-panky in high places from England. And England, of course, ever since the days of Henry VIII and before, in fact, ever since the days of Mordred, has been specializing in hanky. What do you think Chaucer is about? All this hanky-panky. Would you please? And now, this is Sir Geoffrey Pippin Brown, bringing you today's British Broadcasting Corporation third program salute to the Ulster of the Week. There will, by God, always be in England. Everywhere the Englishman goes, he brings courage, he brings character, and he brings Englishness. And so tonight, the British Broadcasting Corporation, as part of its continuing series, presents a salute to an outstanding British Ulster. A Britisher who has seen wars, who has seen peace, the rise and the fall of the empire, and is still in there, as we say today, punching. We now salute today a Labour peer 76 years old, a Labour peer who was just recently acquitted in the courts by a magistrate. And I quote tonight from the official court report. A magistrate decided yesterday that Lord Whig did not go. In fact, the actual fact of it is he did, but he was acquitted. He did go curb crawling in Mayfair one night last September, and as he curb crawled, he accosted women. But the 76-year-old Labour peer was acquitted of insulting behavior, and the magistrate pointed out that curb crawling is not in itself illegal. And we quote here the magistrate, a man of great good common sense. We quote, "It may be highly objectionable, but it is not a chargeable offense," said Mr. Lawrence Tobin, magistrate of Wells Street Court. He did not believe Lord Whig's strenuous denials, and he commended Sergeant Peter McNulty, who arrested this great Labour peer in the act itself of curb crawling. And as Lord Whig left the court, he said, "I am going to appeal this." At that point, the judge says, "Sir, you cannot appeal an acquittal. You're acquitted. However, I do not believe you. You did indeed go curb crawling, and you did indeed accost women in the pursuit of that curb crawling." And now we quote what actually happened. Sergeant McNulty said that he watched Lord Whig approach women, 6 of them, in fact, between 11 and 11:20 p.m. on Friday, September 17th. At least one woman appeared hostile and, in fact, objected and swung her handbag at the Lord. Did this stop him? No, he continued on to the other 5, accosting as he curb crawled. Lord Whig, however, said he had been merely driving around the area looking for a newspaper seller, perhaps to buy a late newspaper at Marble Arch. In fact, he wished to buy an early edition of a morning newspaper and certainly was not looking for unaccompanied women. However, Constable McNulty took issue and said that 6 women at least were approached by Lord Kerb. In fact, as he did so, he did it with loud and often objectionable gestures, calling attention to his behavior. And that in itself became offensive to passers-by who were leaving fashionable theaters in the area. Nevertheless, he was acquitted, since he had given long and illustrious, certainly distinguished service to the realm. And we say, here in this corner, if I may editorialize, a 76-year-old man who curb crawls and accosts 6 unfamiliar women on the street is not a man who is entirely bad. A little of that music, please, son. And so tonight we would like to suggest to you that at least there is one Englishman in all this realm who has not succumbed to what we call the Lavender Revolution. He is a man of uncompromising heterosexual tendencies, and he continues bravely. Tonight's salute to Lord Whig was brought to you by the British Broadcasting Corporation's 3rd Programming. Remember our slogan on this show, there will always, by God, be in England. We will fight them through the hedgerows. We will fight them with blood, sweat, and tears. Stay tuned for Lady Augusta Watkins Glen and her superb program on mosses of northern England. Hold it there, gang. So I just thought you ought to know that our various congressmen are not the only one out there doing a little pinching. Well, now, wait a minute. Kerb, by the way, in England is spelled with a K. It's K-E-R-B. And to curb crawl is a phrase we do not use here. Kerb crawling roughly is cruising. That's the American term for when he's out, looking for a little action. And that's called, he wasn't actually crawling. If you do not know your English terminology, of course, this is always the problem. Englishmen don't quite understand us, and we don't understand their slang. And I'm sure a lot of you thought he was out there crawling around in the curbs there. Well, when you go pub crawling, do you go on all 4s? Or haven't you ever heard the term pub crawl? Well, that's, of course, when you read the Post. They don't have elegant terms like that, but Craig Claiborne uses terms like pub crawling. And that really means one is going from one pub to the other until one finally gets a snootful and you're poured into a cab. Now, they don't actually pour you in. It's a figure of speech. And so in England, to curb crawl. Now, you read this. Now, the minute I read this, I think there's a great story. And here he is. He's a peer and a lord and all that. And he's out there doing his thing. And I like the judge's line to him. Sir, one cannot appeal an acquittal. That's true. Makes sense. If he appeals the acquittal, he's liable to get a reversal. And then he's going to be in the old tank. However, reading this thing, though, I've read this, I thought, oh, wow, that reminds me of one of my most totally embarrassing moments. And it had nothing to do with me, personally. It had to do with reading. I don't know whether there's anyone out there listening who is, people ask me, and this has been asked, when I say people, generally people who are interviewer types. Ordinary walking around people never ask questions like this, but often an interviewer type will say to you, what writer influenced you as a writer? Well,
it's always easy to pick out something really elegant, it's to come on with it. Have you noticed that any time anybody is asked in one of these very nervous journals about what so-and-so recommends to give somebody else for Christmas, it's always some incredible thing like War and Peace. It's, something like Tristram Shandy, something, they're always doing this, because that betrays the elegance of the person who's being talked about. So you always do these things. Somebody will call you up and say, Shepherd, what's the greatest book you ever read? Well, you have to say something like Moby Dick, or, you just got to. Because after all, you've got to keep up with Norman Mailer, who will say something like that. Some guys are unabashed in that kind of junk. But to be honest with you, as a writer, I was influenced. We all are influenced. There's no way for you to escape being being influenced. Now, that doesn't mean you copy somebody. An influence, you see, is somebody you admire very much at a very tender age. To be influenced later in life borders on plagiarism. That's a big different thing there. But when you're a kid, you see, what you read as a kid often really influences you tremendously. Now, I know that many of you aren't readers, so you didn't read as a kid, so you don't have that problem. You weren't influenced by anything but, TV comics or something. But there are kids who are readers. Now, incidentally, I was not the kind of reader who stopped doing everything else and read. That's a whole different game. There were two kinds of readers when I was a kid. There was the little thin kid that stayed at home and read incessantly and spent his Saturdays going to movies. He grew up to be Joel Siegel. There's the other kind of kid that used to just read for kicks, and he did it without any desire to escape from the world. He just read. He read, and he did all the rest of it. He played second base and then came home and read. But generally, readers don't do that. They really, you're either or in that world. And at a very tender age, another kid put me onto this reading. I mean, this particular writer. Now, up to this point, I'd been reading stuff like the Oz books. I read things like the Tick-Tock Man of Oz. Everybody knows about Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, but I'm one of the guys that know about the Pumpkinhead of Oz. Do you know about that one? All right. Who knows about the Tick-Tock Man of Oz? Tick-Tock and the Land of Oz. It was called Tiktok. These were great Oz stories. So I read every last Oz story, and I was really into that. Well, then one day, this guy who was about 2 or 3 years older than I was, and I really admired him because he built radios. He really did this stuff. One day, I met him in the library, and he says, "Have you ever read this?" And he hands me this book, which came from the adult section, where the real stuff was. And it was then that I met my future once and always influence. Okay. Now, who is the writer? Who does that incident of Lord Whig's remind you of? Now, if you've read any of this guy's work, you immediately know, because his work is filled with all kinds of doddering peers who are always doing incredible stuff, and they're dim-witted nephews. And he writes about England, or did write about England. Who was he? And I didn't even think of it as England. I just thought it was very, very funny stuff. And I had no idea that I was to become, here I was reading this stuff and laughing like crazy, and I was to become later the member of a cult, which is now still in full blown. And most of the people in the cult, I'm afraid, discovered it later. But I was reading this stuff when I was a kid. And we would wait at the library. Miss Easter, the librarian, would say, "Oh, he's come out with a new book, and it'll be in probably in a week. And when it comes in, I'll save it for you." And we used to wait. Luckily, this guy was unbelievably prolific. He wrote about 200 books. And we used to wait every couple of 6 months or so for a new book by this guy. And one day, I'll tell you what happened to me one day. I picked up one of his novels. He wrote novels. He did not write essays and nothing. He wrote novels. And one day, I am sitting in a study hall. Now, you know study halls. We had this Mr. Wilson, who was the study hall teacher. He actually was a history teacher, but he had this study hall. And we'd come in there. It was in the cafeteria. And the cafeteria, they had these great big study halls in the cafeteria. Like, there'd be about 300 kids all sitting around in these tables in the cafeteria. And it was like fifth period in the day. It was a period or so after lunch. and it was called study. Do you remember when you went to study hall? Did they call them study hall around here? Study hall. Okay. So we had a study hall. Well, the study hall was a curious place. You know, you were supposed to come in there and do your work there and homework, which I did mostly. I never took homework home. I was one of those kids that never once took homework home. Never. Never. And I always did very well, but I never took homework home. Well, because home was not a place for doing school, as far as I was concerned. It was a place for knocking out fly balls and picking up ground balls and building model airplanes and all that stuff. And so I would go to the study hall, and I would do what I had to do in the study hall, but study halls were kind of curious, quiet things. And especially this one was after lunch, and it was always kind of warm in the cafeteria. There's about 300 kids in there from all kinds of classes. There would be seniors in there, and I was a freshman at this point. There would be sophomores, all kinds of people, you know, the elegant-looking girls reading history books, and there were guys who were in a football team sitting around there doing algebra and stuff, and it was a study hall. And Mr. Wilson would walk around the study hall, and he looked a little bit like David Niven, kind of an elegant guy, you see, very elegant type. And he had kind of, you know, that thin face, and he dressed elegantly, and he was quiet. I always had the feeling later, as I thought about Mr. Wilson was one of those guys whose life was early blighted, that obviously was a man cut out for much better than teaching history in high school. But here he is. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but there are some men that are born to be knighted. And so he's walking around quietly that day. And I made a dumb mistake, really a dumb mistake. I had this book, which was written by my favorite author. And I shouldn't have been reading it in the study hall because it's really dangerous. You know what it's like? It's like playing with matches in a celluloid comb factory. I mean, you can you can get yourself into one hell of a mess just because of later what happened. Had it been any other book and any other author, it would not have happened. I am not saying it was dangerous to read a book in study hall. It was dangerous to read this guy in study hall. Now, why? Well, all right. He was not obscene. So if that, I'll have to warn you right away. If you go, oh, I know, yeah, dirty. No, nothing at all like that. See, you got such a literal mind. There are many other kinds of danger, and those are the ones that count. And so I'm sitting there. I got this book, very innocently, see, and I'm sitting back there, and I remember I had some trigonometry that I was working on. Now, trigonometry was always easy for me. I could knock off trig, anything in trig, in about 8.5 seconds. I mean, always, because it was so logical, you know. It was anything that's logical, I never had any trouble with. It was stuff like chemistry, where you had to take a lot of it on faith. Just believe us. This is what happens when you mix this up with that, you know. They said, we don't quite know why it produces this ding-dong with the valences hanging on the side, but it does. So you had to remember this stuff. But trig was, you know, really nice. A short distance between straight lines and cosine, sines. And I always liked to work a problem that had cosecants in it. Yeah, cosecants. You don't even know what they are, right? Secants. You can look up. That's your word for tonight. S-E-C-A-N-T. And so I'm sitting there, you know, and I'm working away. And I finished my trigonometry in about 5 minutes. So I'm fooling around. And that night, we had football practice. Remember this. I played football, right? And I was on the freshman ball club. So I'm sitting around there. And I didn't want to tire my eyes. Athletes tend to do that. They really do, you know, because you get yourself too tired reading algebra. And, you know, so I'm sitting there, and I got this notebook. Now, notebooks were very big in our school. In fact, in certain classes, you had to turn in a yearly notebook. Now, there were very, very precise girls who loved that. They got great grades. They were very dumb girls, generally. There is a kind of person who gets great grades by being very neat and memorizing everything. So I'm serious. This is one of the great failures of education. You can actually come out a PhD and not know a damn thing. You have memorized everything. You have very neat notebooks. And you wind up with a PhD with the mind of a gnat. Also, these same people, due to the fact that they had low intelligence, generally had self-erasers built into their mind. They had a memory span of about 8 or 9 milliseconds, just long enough to pass the test. And if you ask them, and unfortunately, they go into the business later. They start teaching the same thing to later people, but, you know, that's where it all goes. It's terrible to see a teacher who can't read teaching a class in reading, and I have seen that. But, yes, I have seen it. It's terrible to see a teacher standing up at the board and her lips are moving when she's reading the speller. So, you know, so anyway, I'm sitting back there in the class, little realizing that I was about to be struck by a lightning bolt from an author who was not only an author, but he was an English author, wouldn't have even understood the Warren G. Harding School, would have thought it was a joke, and he was writing about an England that never was, that he imagined. And I'm sitting there reading this thing, and here it is in the quiet of a study hall, when all of a sudden the hero was arrested for striking a policeman with a fish. Now, it's not the way I tell it. I'm not trying to tell it the way he wrote it. But the hero is out there celebrating what is known as boat night, regatta night. Now, we don't have regattas in Hammond, Indiana. We didn't have a thing called boat night. And there was no place called Cambridge or Oxford. There were no lords, anything like that. I just knew that a lord was something that you saw in Charles Laughton movies, and they often wrote letters with quill pens with feathers on the top. Anyway, all of a sudden, this guy, Freddie Threepwood, struck a policeman heavily with a fish while he was on a curb, while he was looking for a girl. And not only did he strike him with a fish, he stole the cop's hat. When the cop fell heavily to the ground, Freddie Threepwood picked up, and you know they have those big round Bobbie hats, he grabbed the hat and ran down the street. Now, the way the writer wrote it, again, as I say, it's all style. I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden I see Freddie Threepwood hit this cop in the mouth with a frozen fish. The cop falls heavily to the ground, muttering an English oath. Urgh! It's an English arg! As he fell heavily to the ground. Well, I'm sitting there reading in study hall. Now, up to this point, I'd been very circumspect in study hall. I had never blown the gaff at all there. Because, again, you got to understand, I played on a freshman ball team, and all teachers were after all ball players. Because all the teachers in our school weighed 80, 85 pounds, had thick, some of them had bifocals at the age of 2 or 3 months. And so they all hated athletes of all types. So an athlete has to, by the way, be damn near a Rhodes Scholar to get a C in many classes. That's a fact. And the better you are, the more you have to be a Rhodes Scholar to get a C. I mean, they always felt sorry for guys who were on the third team. Those guys always got A's. I mean, if you made the first team and wound up with a letter in your freshman year, you were in trouble. So anyway, I'm sitting there, you know, trying to play it straight when all of a sudden, without warning, I could not stop. I started to laugh. I laughed out loud. Well, instantly, about 15 people at the table in the study hall look around. What the hell's going on? I can't stop, see? And at that point, Mr. Wilson, who was standing over by the Venetian blinds, looks over at me. He's all the way across the room, and I'm laughing like hell. There's nobody around me. There's just me laughing. Well, you got to understand, I was in a room full of illiterates. And the idea of laughing at a book was totally unknown, as it is in today's high schools. Most people think that Jerry Lewis falling down the stairs is funny. I never did, even in those days. At the age of 15, I would not have laughed at Phyllis Diller. I don't know why. Everybody else in my family did. Nobody else read, me. And so I am laughing like hell. I'm laughing. I can't stop. And as I try to stop, it comes worse. And I'm laughing. At this point, I can feel my face is getting red, and everybody's looking around. And Mr. Wilson comes running over, and he says, "What's the matter? What's going on?" And I can't stop. And at that point, he started me off again. I thought of the fish. I thought of Freddie Threepwood, and I thought of his uncle. He had this uncle named Lord Blandings, who had a pig, by the way, named the Empress of Blandings. And I'm yelling like hell, see. At that point, I'm yelling out loud, and they drag me. 3 guys. He finally says, "Here, help me." He calls 3 other guys over, and they take me out of the study hall screaming and yelling. They take me down to the nurse, and they're pouring water on my head. And as I'm going down through the halls with Mr. Wilson behind me. He takes my book on my notebook. Everything's fine. He takes my notebook and my book, and he looks at it. He sees what I'm reading. He hands it back to me, and we get down to the office, and I'm really being given hell, for disrupting the study hall, and my face, I had a bloody nose, everything from laughing. And when I'm coming out, Mr. Wilson says, "Listen, kid," he says, "anybody that reads P.G. Wodehouse is going to come to no good end." And he's right. Had I been influenced by Melville, I would have gone on to make Philip Roth look like a greasy kid that he really is. Had I gone on to be influenced by War and Peace, I would have made Norman Mailer look like the guy that writes the script for Little Orphan Annie. But I was influenced by P.G. Wodehouse, one of the great comic writers of all time. May he rest in peace. Of course, he wouldn't buy that. Yes, he would. I mean, he believed in that. By the way, he ended his days living on Long Island. And he wrote some of the greatest stuff ever written in the language, if you like to laugh. Leave it to Smith.